In April 1912, a discovery was made at the Hollybrook Cemetery, Southampton, when a pair of binoculars were found on a headstone along with a note where an unknown person or people wrote an apology to a survivor who was one of the lookouts that spotted the iceberg that sank the White Star liner, the RMS Titanic. The survivor, whose headstone was distributed, was lookout Frederick Fleet, whose life had been shadowed by the disaster in life and was victimized because of a disgusting and tasteless prank while he continued to rest in peace. In this video, we are looking into the story behind this tasteless prank and give a short brief on the lookout's binoculars and the mystery of their whereabouts a century ago. Before we get into it all, let's have a short introduction of Fleet himself. Frederick Fleet began his career with the White Star Line when he served as a lookout on board the RMS Oceanic in 1908. 4 years later, he signed onto the Titanic in 1912, where he was joined by 5 other lookouts, including his partner, Reginald Lee. As a lookout, Fleet would have worked in the crow's nest, where he and Reginald Lee would scan the ocean for signs of danger. During the Titanic's voyage, the lookouts would work in 2-hour shifts and would have taken 2 shifts a day, having 4 hours off duty. But the crow's nest could take 2 people at a time, so the lookouts were paired up together and they would remain in pairs for the rest of the voyage. On the night of the disaster, Fleet and Lee relieved their colleagues Archie Jewell and George Simmons at 10 p.m. Before he and Lee began their shift, Simmons advised the pair to keep a sharp lookout for small ice. At 11:39 p.m, Fleet saw a black mass ahead. Immediately, he struck 7 bells and telephoned the bridge. After 6th Officer James Moody picked up the telephone, Fleet cried, "Are you there?" When Officer Moody asked, "Yes, what do you see?" Fleet cried the infamous words, "Iceberg, right ahead." While he was still on the phone, Fleet saw the collision between the Titanic and the iceberg on the starboard side. 20 minutes later, both Fleet and Lee were relieved by Alfred Evans and George Hogg. In the middle of the sinking, Second Officer Charles Lightoller asked him to help Quartermaster Robert Hitchens to load and launch lifeboat number 6. He later went into the same lifeboat before it was picked up by the RMS Carpathia at 6 a.m. Following the sinking, Fleet was questioned in the American, British and Ryan inquiries before he left the White Star Line in August 1912. After he left, Fleet went on to work for the Union Castle and Harland and Wolff before he became a newspaper salesman for the Evening Echo. In 1965, following a battle with depression, Fleet took his own life. He was buried in a pauper's grave at the Hollybrook Cemetery. That was until 1993 when the Titanic Historical Society erected a headstone through public donations. On the 18th of April 2012, the British newspaper The Guardian published an article on Fleet when someone left a pair of binoculars with a note on his headstone. The story of this sick event began on the week before the 100th anniversary of the disaster, when crowds of people, including members of the British Titanic Society, laid wreaths on the headstone. However, the wreaths were stolen by an individual or a group of people, and they replaced them with the binoculars, as well as a note. Under the alias name Francis, that's Francis with an I, the note was written in a tasteless tone where he, she or they apologised to Fleet about not having binoculars on board the Titanic. Dear Fred, sorry for bringing these 100 years too late, but better late than never. You said that if you had these, you would have had time enough to get the Titanic away from the iceberg. So, here they are. Love, Francis. To this day, no one knows the real name of the person or the people who laid down the binoculars on Fleet's headstone, and until this person comes forward, we will never know the true identities of those horrible pranksters who victimized Fleet, making him responsible for the sinking of the Titanic. However, Fleet wasn't to blame because he did everything he could, and he couldn't do anything to prevent the ship from hitting the iceberg. A huge piece of evidence for this is the information about the mysterious whereabouts of the binoculars in the first place. While the Titanic was docked in Southampton, there was a switch in crew members, and this change led to the dismissal of one officer, Second Officer David Blair. However, Blair's dismissal was a misconception, as it was believed that when he left the Titanic, Blair took the keys to the cabinet for the binoculars that were thought to be inside. But according to the testimonies of George Simmons and Frederick Fleet himself, the men said that the ship's binoculars were located in a box or a bag in the port after corner, which happened to be inside the crow's nest. During every voyage on the White Star Line and other line ships, lookouts were provided for them. But when the voyages were over, the binoculars would be handed back to the second officer. In the Titanic's case, the lookouts would have handed them back to Second Officer David Blair, but when Blair was dismissed, they would have handed them back to Second Officer Charles Lightoller. But when the Titanic left Southampton, Fleet said in the US inquiry that the lookouts knew that there were no binoculars. The reason why for this was that during the voyage, one pair of binoculars was on the bridge, a pair that was for the ship's senior officers and the commander. However, in the British inquiry, George Hogg explained that in Belfast, he had a pair or the binoculars on the Titanic's journey from Belfast to Southampton following her sea trials. When the ship was in Southampton, Hogg requested access to them but was denied since the whereabouts were unknown. Despite this, the binoculars wouldn't have made a difference even if they were used to spot the iceberg. The story of the binoculars on Frederick Fleet's headstone is one of disgust and false accusations. It is tasteless to see that someone could get away with a prank while disrespecting the deceased. It is wrong, cruel, and it is harmful to Frederick Fleet and his family. But from all of this, we can learn an important lesson. Never play pranks in cemeteries.